Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 26 of the podcast. We have a great show lined up. We have two guests joining us. We have Susan Pease Goudroy and Vicky Larson joining us. They are authors of this great book called The New I Do. We had a very interesting conversation regarding marriage. There's this very progressive concept that they have come up with. It is called a parenting marriage. We also talked about the top reasons that lead to divorce. But before we get to the episode, I'd like to invite you to support our sponsors, because when you support the sponsors, you support this podcast. In the show notes, you will find links to Onnit. Onnit makes some of the most amazing natural supplements that you can find anywhere on the planet. I recommend that you check them out. I am personally a big fan of the Alpha Brain, and I'm also a fan of the T+. Now, in the wintertime, and lucky for us, the winter's almost over. In the wintertime, I always take Shroom Tech Immune and Virutech, and I take these religiously, and I have survived the winter, luckily, with one cold the entire winter. And this has been a brutal winter here in the Northeast. Normally, I don't get colds, and I started the Shroom Tech Immune and the Virutech, I want to say like mid to late October. And that's right around the time that I got my first cold, my first and only cold. And with these supplements, I know for a fact that the cold was cut in half. Normally, a cold for me lasts about 5 to 6 days. In like 2.5 days, I was feeling better and back to normal and back to work. So check them out. The link will be in the show notes. When you purchase with that link, you support the podcast, and we can continue to bring you great content week in and week out. Also, there is a link to Amazon, and if you shop on Amazon, make sure you use that affiliate link. It's also in the show notes. And I would ask that you bookmark this link so that every time you shop at Amazon, we get a small little kickback. Another great way to support the podcast. So we've got lots of fun things stored. Stick around. You do not want to be left out.
From A1 Studios in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, New York, this is the Rob Aguilar Show.
Susan, Vicky, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here. Thank you, Rob.
I came across a fascinating article, Parenting Marriage. And this is a concept that when I was reading the article, and I said, wow, there are so many marriages out there where people are staying together, and they stay together for the most part, from what I hear, for the kids, for the children. They're bickering, they're fighting, they're yelling at each other, and it's a very hostile and unhealthy environment to raise children in. But your concept kind of negates all that and creates a different environment where you are staying together for the children, but it becomes a healthier environment for all parties involved. How did this concept come about?
I am a therapist, and I have been working with couples who have been either contemplating divorce or in the process of divorce for about 15 years now. And something that happened about 5 years ago was I had one couple that just simply didn't want a divorce. Nobody wanted to miss tucking the kids in at night, but they also didn't want to stay married. And we came up with a plan where they could divide their house and they could stay living in the house. They were actually wonderful co-parents. They just didn't want to be romantic partners anymore. And so they divided the house and they maintained this relationship, and I helped them, what I call, change their job description so that they understood that their role had shifted from being romantic partners to now simply co-parents and providing a stable house for their children.
How do you introduce such a concept to the children?
I think basically just be honest about what's happening, and you don't have to say mom and dad aren't intimate partners anymore, but you can say something like, we're changing our relationship and we're going to be more friends now. And kids don't have to get the whole thing. I think what's important is just not to lie to kids, not to try to pretend that something's going on when it isn't, because children see through that. And when parents are not fully honest, it teaches kids not to trust their own perceptions.
Do you even think it's worth it to tell children? Try to explain this to them, or should you just kind of let it be and they might not even notice things have changed anyway?
Well, that's true. And I think that it really depends on each couple's circumstances. If the children ask, certainly you want to tell them what's going on. And not every situation do you have to make such an announcement. Maybe it never was an intimate marriage to begin with. But the thing about what Vicki and I are proposing, and in particular with the parenting marriage that I propose with couples, is that it's a conscious decision rather than a default mode that you just landed on. That we want people to be having conversations and be in agreement about this arrangement.
Right. And Rob, also parents, people who want to have children can actually go into the marriage that way. And we met couples who were like that, who are saying, we're committing to stay together for 18 years till our child is launched, and we're going to do this, this, and this. They kind of wrote out a contract of how they're going to raise the child and what they're going to do. And so, again, it is a very conscious decision.
So they'll go into this beforehand.
Right. And actually, we found websites that are like Match.com, but they are for co-parenting people. It's men and women who want to be parents. They don't want to raise children alone necessarily, but they're also not necessarily looking for a romantic partner. They're looking for a co-parent. And based on their values and their ideas of raising a child, they kind of come up with a plan. Well, are we going to live together, or are we going to live separately? But here's how we're going to divide the finances and the responsibilities. And as anyone who's tried to raise a child alone, it's challenging and it's expensive. But co-parenting gives an entirely different twist on that.
Wow, that's very interesting. That's almost like an arranged marriage that you hear about in some cultures.
Absolutely. That was actually the most shocking piece of information that we got when we were doing the research for The New I Do. I had never heard of such websites. But, what I think is happening to marriage in general, and divorce for that matter, is that it's becoming more of a spectrum of choices rather than a black and white. You're either in the marriage or you're not.
Just in general, marriages or the way humans interact with each other is so complex to a certain degree and you hear so many statistics with regards to divorce rates. I heard a couple of years ago that 50% of marriages ended in divorce. I don't know how accurate that is today, but that is kind of like a scary statistic, which kind of tells me, do humans even belong, or couples, do we even belong married because of that supposed high divorce rate?
That statistic is a myth, and that was recently debunked by two economists, Justin Wolfers. He's a University of Michigan economist, and his wife, Betsy Stevenson, is in the Obama administration as an economist. And there was a huge spike in divorce rates right after no-fault divorce became the norm, and then that kind of tapered off. So according to Justin Wolfers, about 70% of marriages that began in the 1990s reached their 15th anniversary. So, and he says if those who married in the 2000s, if the trends continue, that nearly 2/3 of marriages will never involve a divorce. So, but that seems to be happening mostly among college-educated people, people who have high school educations or less than a full year degree tend to be divorcing and remarrying a little bit more. But you talk about whether we are made to be long-term. Helen Fisher, who does love research for Match.com, said that back in the hunter and gathering days, there were multiple pair bondings. And she believes that we're going to be seeing that again. And already that is indeed so. The Pew came out with some numbers not too long ago that said 4 out of 10 newlyweds in 2013 had been married before. 40% is pretty high.
That is high.
I think the good news, though, for couples who have children and who are considering divorcing, but really torn about whether they should do that and what the repercussions will be on the kids, there are more options. And I wanted to comment on something you said earlier, Rob, about the fighting. And there's tons of research out there showing that it isn't divorce that harms children. It is parents fighting. And so parents can stay together, as mine did, for 10 years longer than they should have, and continued to fight and cause more damage than if they split and went their separate ways amicably. But obviously the best scenario for kids is if parents can stay together and not fight and figure out how to do that. And one of the ways that the parenting marriage serves them is when you take love out of the equation and that pressure that comes with being a spouse, that, as we define it now, that is, it makes all the difference in the world. And I have now worked with several couples who have transformed their marriage from a romantic-based marriage into a parenting marriage. And it entails some work. You have to figure out the rules that you're going to go by, but it is doable if you get along well enough.
Rob, I was going to add that maybe couples who are transforming their marriage may not come back romantically, but from people we heard from our studies around the world who were in arranged marriages, they talk, and they went in without love, without romantic love. They said when they saw their husband caring for their kids and going out and working and doing all of these things, that was love to them. So they fell in love with this person who was being kind to the children they had. And so maybe the people who come together as co-parents might fall in love that way if they see that love building that way.
I think something happens when couples work together and everything is kind of running smoothly. Of course, in a perfect ideal world, it would be like that every day. But I can speak for personal experience. When my wife and I were having our first child, and I saw her go through labor and deliver that baby like a champion. And we were working together. I was there and I was part of the delivery as much as I possibly could. Something happened, something triggered, I saw her in a completely other different light. I was in love with her, but I was in love with her 10 times more because here she is giving birth to our child, and she had made a commitment to not use any of the painkillers, any of the drugs. She was going to do this as naturally as possible. And we worked together as a team during that labor, and it just kind of brought us even more together. So I kind of see when people, even when couples go to the gym and work out together or do something athletic like a race or take on a project together, it almost kind of brings them closer. And I can see why in those cultures where they didn't start out loving each other, but as time went on, they saw how they worked as a team and they did things for each other. It brought them closer, and then love was born.
Well, paradoxically, the very things that often bring couples together at some point are the things that they're fighting over. So it's a very tricky line to maintain, and there are lots of books out there about how to keep your relationship as the primary focus, and that's great. It gets very complicated, especially when you have a second or a third child and life does its thing and throws you curveballs. And so it is possible. Obviously, we see people do it. But, it just gets trickier.
Part of the reason why we really encourage anyone going into any of the marriages that we have in the book is we encourage them to create a contract. Because when you talk about a lot of these things, typically the things that make couples fight, chores and parenting and this and that, if you write things down, you're really giving a lot of thought. You're coming to agreements early on. You're seeing some potential rough areas. And of course, things will change, but part of the contract is also that you spend time to renegotiate it. You check in every once in a while. How is this going? What do we need to change? And it holds each of you accountable, and easier not to just fall apart when things get a little bit rough about parenting or so on.
Is children the number one reason why couples get divorced?
I actually don't have that particular stat in front of me, but I know that the top 3 reasons are money, children, and, oh gosh, what's the third? Money, children.
Infidelity?
Infidelity, for sure. Money, children, and I can't think of the third one, so maybe it is infidelity.
So would you say it's in that order? Money, children, and infidelity?
Kids. Yeah, I think kids are definitely one of the higher reasons that parents fight and break up.
Is it because they add stress to the relationship?
Absolutely. One of the dynamics that is kind of cliche, but is something I see certainly a lot, is the primary caregiver, which tends to be the woman, has a stronger bond with the children, and so the other spouse feels left out and feels pushed out. So whether that is, it can be the same dynamic in a same-sex marriage, but whoever is the primary caregiver is bonding more with the children, and the other spouse feels pushed away and distant. And of course, the issue of running after kids all day long. The last thing you want to do at the end of the day is have sex. And so when sex falls away from a marriage, it can make the people feel less close and less intimate, obviously.
The research has proven that the first 2 years after a child is born, marital satisfaction goes down. And for men, it lingers a little bit longer. So, and perhaps because of what Susan brought up, is that often the baby is a little bit closer to the mother, and he's maybe lost his playmate and his, his sexual partner for a little bit. But also, I did some research that's not in the book. Children are born with problems, autism. Jenny McCarthy, a few years ago, when she wrote a book, said that the divorce rate among parents who have autistic children could be as high as 80%. That number was disputed, but to help the National Autism Association create a program to help families with autistic children so that they could afford marital counseling. So ADHD, autism, there just was a huge story this week of a mother who's divorced her husband in Australia because he did not want to give up their child who was born with Down syndrome, and she did. And so children come in all flavors, and that can create stress if your child is not born what we would consider, quote unquote, a normal child. So when there's disabilities or so on, that adds stress to families.
Yeah, but even just having children, I think, is just stressful in itself. It's being responsible for other human beings.
Yes.
It's a big burden when you think about what's involved, because here you have the ability to either form this child to grow up and be a healthy individual, or you can completely ruin this kid and he's going to need therapy for the rest of his life. And it all falls on parenting and how that child is raised. So I can see how that is a lot of pressure. But I wanted to touch on the bonding aspect of things that were just brought up a little bit ago, where I guess the child is bonding more with the primary caretaker and the other parent feels left out. Is that a real perception? Is that bond really that strong, or can the other parent do something to feel part of the equation?
Well, Vicki may want to speak to that because she has children and I don't, but I will say that from my experience professionally, I do think it is a real change in the attachment, that the attachment becomes less to the significant other and more on the children. But Vicki, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I won't speak of my personal experience, but I will say that there is a movement to involve men more in the childbirth, and they're realizing that men also have postpartum depression, and that's never really been, that hasn't been discussed before. And so there is a new consciousness about dads, and what happens to men when they become fathers. Their testosterone levels lessens. So there is a bunch of new research, and I imagine there's going to be more and more about how that is impacting fathers and ways to be proactive about that so that men don't get lost in that process. I think we're going to see more and more of attention being paid to dads. And, also there are about 2 million stay-at-home fathers in the United States right now. Some of them became stay-at-home dads by default. They lost their jobs during the Great Recession and haven't really quite bounced back. And maybe the wife has, or their significant other. Maybe that will change it as well. And I hope so, because I think it's important. Dads play a really important role in the development of their children, especially daughters.
I can only compare it to my situation. Our son is only a year and 6 months old, and my wife nurses or was nursing from the very beginning. So we kind of had, I guess, an agreement on who was going to do what. So she does the nursing. We weren't formula feeding him or anything like that. I couldn't bond with the feeding, but I was given the task, so conveniently, of changing diapers. So I was in charge of changing diapers. She was in charge of the feeding. And I became really quickly an expert, and I never thought that I was going to be able to do this. But I could change a diaper that was pooped, completely in the dark, and change it and clean it. And that was, in a weird way, kind of my way of bonding with my son, I guess, early on. And now we kind of divide the chores. He goes to an art class, a music class, and I'll take him to his art class, she'll take him to his music class, and then we're bonding on our way there and while we're there. So I think there are ways of figuring out how everyone can be included in the process so nobody feels left out.
Yeah, and I think the key there, it sounds like you and your wife are having some conscious conversations, but that's exactly what Vicki and I are proposing, is that we really want people to have more conversations about every aspect of marriage and raising kids together. And so that's true in any number of the other marriages that we uncovered that are going on out there, such as living apart together. So it doesn't matter what flavor of marriage or what your focus is, as long as you're both communicating and making agreements consciously.
A lot of couples are choosing to remain child-free. And that is addressed in the book as well, because their experiences are entirely different, and the things that they're going to argue about or bond with are going to be different than people who decide to have children.
Infidelity was also brought up, for the most part, at least many things that I've read. Men and women tend to not be faithful based on different things. And maybe you can share some light on that. When a woman cheats, I think it's for very different reasons for the most part, in the general sense, when compared to the reasons why men cheat.
I'm going to disagree with you, Rob, on that. That's what a lot of people and so-called experts want to tell us, that women do it for love and emotional reasons, and men do it just for purely sex. And, as long as people keep saying that, then people will still believe that. I don't believe that's necessarily so. But we don't really get into why people are cheating. We are looking at the fact that even though huge percentages say sexual infidelity is wrong in a marriage, we have a high infidelity rate. And it's hard to really get a grasp on that because it's self-reported, and not everyone wants to tell the truth about what they're doing. So rates are somewhere about 20% of the population to 70 or 80%. We don't really know. But regardless of what the rate is, we all know infidelity exists. We probably have experienced it in friends or families or neighbors. We know it exists. So whatever the percentage is irrelevant. The fact is, maybe sexual fidelity shouldn't necessarily be a part of a marriage. monogamy is assumed, but monogamy is a choice. And a lot of people don't talk about, am I good at monogamy? And I don't think couples tend to talk about that. Or are we going to be monogamous? Why might we choose to be monogamous? Are we good at monogamy? And we hope to get couples to have those conversations so that if they choose monogamy, they're actually choosing it. It's not just an assumption.
And another thing that Helen Fisher just came out in an article talking about is that her prediction is that we as a species are going to get back to much more serial monogamy. If indeed, we are monogamous at all, that maybe we aren't meant, after all, to be with one person till death do us part. And we don't advocate for or against open marriages. We just say this is an option that fits certain people. Right now we have a one-size-fits-all model for how it is to be a spouse and a parent. And so we're suggesting that maybe there should be more sizes to choose from because there are so many variations on who we are as people and our lifestyles. We have so many more choices today.
I know a lot of guys who will say that biology simply does not allow them to be monogamous, and we were never meant to be, and maybe it's their way, how they justify what they do, but there's guys out there that's what they believe. It's biologically not possible for a man to be only with one woman.
Well, if you read, there are two books by Lou Anne Brizendine. She wrote The Female Brain and The Male Brain. And there is some truth to the fact that the sex center in the male brain is much larger than the woman's, and the verbal center in the woman's brain is a lot larger than the male's. So there are some physiological differences, and I do believe we are wired for certain tasks.
That said, whatever our biology is telling us, we have a brain that can override the biology. If you don't want to cheat, you don't have to cheat. And so, but if you're not good at monogamy, then why not be open, honest, and transparent about that? And that is what we are, advocating for, that people address what they know about themselves or what they might suspect about themselves, or at least be willing to explore, why am I monogamous? And
so do you think it's okay for a man, before he gets married with a woman, to say, you know what, I have a really tough time being with one woman, and I'm really not good at this whole monogamy thing. We can get married, but be warned that I might mess around with other women out there.
No. That's not how I would want it to go. But certainly, I think a lot of men, a lot of couples would not get together if that's how one person presented it and said, I'm really not good at monogamy, because he or she who says that knows that most likely this person they're interested in romantically is going to run away unless the other person is also open to consensual non-monogamy. So you would really need to find someone who is interested in that. Or
talk about finding your soulmate, huh?
Yeah, matching expectations. And I think the scenario that you put out is certainly better than the person knowing it, not saying anything, and then having multiple affairs. The devastation that I've seen from somebody having affairs and being dishonest is way worse, I think, than being open about it in the beginning and saying, this is who I am, I know my limitations. But ideally, it's not, this is how I'm going to be and you need to live with it. It's, this is what I'd like to propose that we both have the option for in our marriage.
Yeah, and then, relationships where one person goes along with it just to appease the other person, that's when people say, oh, well, open relationships don't work. And they probably don't work in this situation because one person is not going into it willingly. It's a big thing to do that. And so you really need to be open, honest, and transparent about that, and find somebody who is like-minded about that. And, we interviewed a number of couples who decided to open up their marriage for a while. And they felt that they had done something very brave to do that. And they knew that they were taking risks. And they pushed themselves to explore the levels of their jealousy and this and that. And they came out of it actually closer and better. And then they were making a conscious decision. Yeah, I'm choosing monogamy. While there were things about non-monogamy that I liked, I prefer this. And so that's great. And, let's be honest, there are many, many ways to damage a relationship that are not, sexual. You can be critical of your partner. You can be emotionally abusive. So there are many, many ways to be horrible to your partner, other than infidelity. But why even have to go there? Why not just start the relationship being open, honest about, do we do well with monogamy? Why do we want it?
Another thing that I hear often, that relationships are work, that you have to work at a relationship to make it better. I mean, work is work. Why should I have to come home from work and work at a relationship? Do you ever hear anything like that?
It does. I'm glad you're bringing this point up, because I think that it's not work, it's how much work, I think, is really a better focus of this question. I think there's a romantic ideal out there that if the relationship is the right one, it's easy and there's no work. And I feel like that is not fair. People think that, I had to come home and have a serious conversation and it got hard and therefore I shouldn't be in this relationship anymore. I think that, as we said earlier, life throws curveballs, relationships are complicated. It does take work. It takes, effort. It takes conscious focus. I think if it becomes more work and difficult, task than you're getting enjoyment out of it, that's when you may want to reevaluate. But I just think that it's, not fair to assume that it should never be any work or that it doesn't take effort.
I have a problem with the word work. I say, there has been some research of what makes a successful and happy marriage. And a lot of it is things like appreciation. If you want to consider appreciation of your spouse's work, that I suppose you can frame it that way, but when you are appreciative of your spouse's efforts and note it, that makes your spouse feel good. I'm not sure that that's work. Complacency is a relationship killer. It gets boring, it gets static. So some of the recent research indicates that the couples that do things together, learn new things together, tend to have happier, more successful partnerships. Is that work, or is that just an action that is bonding you? I don't know. You can call it work.
That actually sounds like fun. You're going out there and doing things together. That's fun. That sounds like fun to me.
When Vicki was talking, I got an image of a plant, and that you wouldn't get a plant and never feed or water it. And whether feeding or watering feels laborious or fun, that is really your perspective. But I really appreciate what Vicki's saying about the language.
Some plants are cacti and they need a lot of water.
That's right. Know what you're buying.
Exactly.
So you have to know your partner and each other's needs and act accordingly, I think.
I think what happens, something that was brought up before, life happens and it throws you a curveball. And I've seen situations where, let's say, someone loses their job, the wife loses the job or the husband loses the job, and things get tough. Money gets tough. That's what puts the stress on the marriage, and then one is ready to go because I just can't deal with this stress. This is too much. And I think that people aren't willing necessarily to tough it out. It's not so much where it's work, but if you're really there as a team, then you have to kind of handle things accordingly when life happens and not necessarily be ready to bail out and take the easy way out.
Well, one of the things that we discovered is that there are basically three different types of marriers. There are the marriers who will not divorce no matter what. There are the people who think marriage is, a light commitment and they could get out any time. And then by far the majority of the people are those who take the commitment seriously and really struggle with the decision of whether to leave or not. I do think there are more people today that don't see marriage as a lifelong commitment. But again, one of the things that Vicki and I talk about is the only measure right now that we have of a successful marriage is the longevity. And when Brad Pitt left Jennifer Aniston, he said, I feel like we had a very successful marriage. The Gores felt like they had a very successful marriage. Because it ends does not equal failure, and we really don't like that term, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we measure a marriage by, I believe.
That's a great point, because I've heard many couples, when they get divorced, they consider it a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they raised great kids. Maybe they did a lot of things together, but for some reason it had to come to an end, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it was a failure. It just wasn't fit for you at that moment.
Right.
And change and grow. Yeah.
Right. And that's why, we really do encourage in the book, regardless of the model, that you create a marital contract, that you actually do talk about some potential things that could happen. Let's say there's a career move and someone wants to move. It's a great opportunity across the country. Does he have to give up his career for her, to move with her? Like, you kind of talk those things out. What are we willing to do? What are we not going to do? How are we going to handle it if some of these kind of potential things are going to come up? And also to constantly reassess, not constantly, but every so often, reassess the contract and decide, is this marriage a success by what we set out to accomplish in it? So we do talk about renewable contracts in there. If you've raised your children and you now want to end the marriage because you basically did the goal of the marriage, that's not a failure. That's not a failure.
Where can people buy this awesome book?
People can buy the awesome book. We have a website called thenewidobook.com. And we have links to Amazon and Goodreads. Vicki, do you happen to have the information from Seal Press on the special that they're offering?
I think it's actually on the Seal Press website.
Or they can go to our Facebook page.
They can go to our Facebook page.
Which is also called The New I Do.
Right. And Seal Press, if you go to their website, which is sealpress.com, they will tell you that you can enter on Goodreads a contest to win a copy of the book, and through March 15th, with various retailers, you can download an ebook for $1.99, which is a special price. You can follow us on Twitter at The New I Do. And we're on Amazon and in bookstores.
And we love people's feedback, even if it is disagreeing with some of the premises, but we really welcome all conversations about how marriage needs to evolve.
Susan Pease-Goudois, Vicki Larson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a lot of fun, very informative, and I think we all learned a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Really great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
This has been an A1 Broadcasting podcast.